Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Adventure and Mystery Book Club. I'm Bill Mallory, branch manager of the La Jolla Library. So glad you could join me for today's reading. We are, of course, reading 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. When we last read on Monday, we went through chapters 1, 2, and 3. And essentially, what's going on is that um, uh, professor in marine biology, Pierre Aronnax, is has heard about these tales of a something they believe to be a giant creature which is going around damaging ships, sinking ships. All of a sudden, every missing vessel is now laid blame to this creature for the attack because they found several larger ships with a puncture hole in the hull, which has caused some of the smaller ships to sink, but the larger ships, of course, can withstand a puncture and still limp back to the harbor. And the shape of this puncture is an isosceles triangle. So, not something necessarily made in nature, but something that looks man made. Yet, however, Professor Aronnax has said that um, his belief is that it is a gigantic narwhal. And so that is his working theory. Everyone's been sort of asking him what his opinion is, and so that's what that's where he's going with this. So, in an effort to capture or kill this creature that is attacking ships, uh, the American government has sent out a ship called the Abraham Lincoln, and it is commanded by Commander Farragut, and they have invited Professor Aronnax to be part of this journey to go after this creature. So he and his manservant have just joined the ship, and that is where we start. And Jeff says giant squids are the best squids. I cannot deny that. So we are reading chapter 4, which is entitled Ned Land. Commander Farragut was a good sailor, worthy of the frigate he commanded. His vessel and he were one. He was the soul of the ship. As for the whale we were after, he had no doubts about it, and he would not let the men on board even discuss whatever doubts they may have had. He believed in it as some old women believe in the Leviathan. For him, it was an act of faith, not logic. The monster existed, and he would rid the seas of it. He had sworn he would. He was a kind of knight of Rhodes, and Dudon de Gozon, going off to meet the dragon laying waste to his island. Either Commander Farragut would kill the narwhal, or the narwhal would kill Commander Farragut. There was no middle course. The officers on board shared their leader's feelings. One had to hear them talk, discuss, argue, and calculate the various chances of an encounter, and see them watch the wide expanse of ocean. More than one voluntarily stood watch on the cross trees, a duty he would have cursed under any other circumstances. As long as the sun was in the sky overhead, the masts were full of sailors so impatient that they could not bear just staying on deck, even though the Abraham Lincoln was not yet furrowing the suspect waters of the Pacific. As for the crew, they asked nothing better than to meet the unicorn fish, harpoon it, and bring it on board to cut it up. They surveyed the sea tirelessly. Besides, Commander Farragut had mentioned a certain sum of $2,000 reserved for whoever, cabin boy or sailor, master or officer, sighted the animal first. I leave the reader to imagine how eyes were strained on board the Abraham Lincoln. As for me, I did not lag far behind the others, and personally did my share of daily watching. The frigate was like the mythological Argus with its 100 eyes. Only Conseil appeared indifferent to what so interested us. He alone was out of step with the general enthusiasm on board. As I said before, Commander Farragut had carefully equipped his boat with various devices for hunting this gigantic creature. A whaling ship could not have been better armed. We had every known device, from hand-thrown harpoons to blunderbusses, which shot out barbed arrows, and swivel guns with exploding shells. On the forecastle stood a special breech-loading cannon, with a thick barrel and narrow bore, just like the one which was to appear in the Exposition of 1867. This precious gun, invented by the Americans, could, without the slightest difficulty, send a conical projectile weighing 9 pounds into a distance of 10 miles. The Abraham Lincoln, therefore, lacked no weapons of destruction, but it had something even better. It had Ned Land, the king of harpooners. Ned Land was a Canadian gifted with extraordinary coordination, and he had no rival in his dangerous profession. He possessed qualities of skill and coolness, courage and cunning to an extraordinary degree, and it was only the cleverest of whales that could escape the blow of his harpoon. Ned Land was about 40. He was more than 6 feet tall and powerfully built. Uncommunicative, sometimes violent and very hot-tempered when thwarted. He attracted one's attention mostly because of his piercing eyes. I think that Commander Farragut did wisely in taking this man on board. He alone was worth the whole crew because of his eye and arm. He was like a powerful telescope, and at the same time like a cannon, always ready to go off. To say Canadian is the same as saying French, and as untalkative as Ned Land was, I must admit that he took a certain liking to me. My nationality undoubtedly attracted him. For him it was a chance to converse, and for me an opportunity to hear that old language of Rabelais, which is still spoken in provinces of Canada. There we go. The Harpooners family came from Quebec, and in the days when this town belonged to France, they already constituted a large clan of hardy fishermen. Little by little, Ned began to take pleasure in talking, and I enjoyed listening to him tell of his adventures in Arctic waters. He would recount his fishing exploits and combats with a great natural sense of poetry. His recitals took on epic form, and I felt as if I were listening to some Canadian Homer singing the Iliad of the far north. Since then, I have gotten to know Ned Land well, and thus I feel I can describe him accurately. We have become old friends, united by that unalterable bond which is born and cemented amid the gravest dangers. Ah, brave Ned! I only ask to live another 100 years so that your memory will remain with me that much longer. And now, what was his opinion about the sea monster? I am forced to admit that he did not believe in the unicorn fish, and that he was the only one on board who did not share the general feeling of conviction. He even avoided talking about it, although I once got him to discuss the creature. One magnificent evening on July 30th, that is to say 3 weeks after we had set sail, the frigate was off Cabo Blanco, 30 miles to the leeward of the Patagonian coast. We had crossed the Tropic of Capricorn, and the Straits of Magellan were less than 700 miles to the south. Within a week, the Abraham Lincoln would be sailing in Pacific waters. Ned Land and I were sitting on the poop talking about one thing and another, and looking at the mysterious sea, whose depths have, till now, remained inaccessible to the eyes of man. In a natural way, I brought the conversation around to the giant sea unicorn and discussed our chances of failing or succeeding. Then, seeing that Ned let me talk on without saying much himself, I pressed him more closely. "Why is it, Ned," I asked, "that you're not convinced that this creature we're chasing really exists? Do you have some special reasons for being so skeptical?" Before answering, the harpooner looked at me for several moments, then struck his broad forehead with his hand, as he often did, closed his eyes as if to gather his thoughts, and finally said, "Maybe I have, Monsieur Aronnax. But a man like you, Ned, who's a professional whaler, who knows about large marine animals, whose imagination could easily accept the idea of huge sea creatures, you should be the last to be skeptical under such circumstances." "That's why you're wrong, Professor," Ned answered. "It's all right for the ordinary people to believe in fabulous comets that streak across the sky, or in prehistoric monsters living inside the earth, but to an astronomer or geologist, these are nothing but a bunch of fantasies. It's the same with a whaler. I've hunted hundreds of them, harpooned many, killed a lot, but no matter how powerful or well armed they were, neither their tails nor their tusks were strong enough to crack the steel plates of a steamer." "But, Ned, they tell of ships that have been pierced right through by a narwhal's tusk." "Maybe wooden ships," answered the Canadian, "but I've never seen it. And until I get some proof to the contrary, I won't admit that ordinary whales, sperm whales, or unicorn fish could do such a thing." "But listen, Ned." "No, Professor, no. You can make it anything you want, but not that. A giant octopus, maybe." "Even less likely, Ned. An octopus is a mollusk, a name that indicates the flabby nature of its flesh. Even if there were such a thing as an octopus 500 feet long, they don't have any bone structure and therefore could never do the slightest damage to ships such as the Scotia or the Abraham Lincoln. So we're forced to admit that stories about krakens or other monsters like that are nothing but pure fables." "But you, even though you're a professor of natural history," continued Ned Land in a sly tone of voice, "you still believe in the possibility of an enormous whale." "Yes, Ned, and my conviction is based on logic and facts. I believe it to be a powerfully built animal belonging to the subkingdom of the vertebrates, like whales and cachalots and dolphins, and armed with a tusk of great penetrating power." "Hmm," said the harpooner, shaking his head with the look of a man who did not want to be convinced. "But you must remember," I replied, "that if such an animal exists, if it inhabits the ocean depths, and if it lives in those layers of water situated several miles below the surface, then it must be built in some incredibly powerful way." "Why?" Ned asked. "Because incalculable strength is needed to stay at great depths and withstand the pressure there." "Really?" said Ned, blinking. "Yes, and I could give you some figures to prove it easily." "Ah, figures," answered Ned. "You can make figures do whatever you want." "Perhaps in business, Ned, but not in mathematics. Now listen. The pressure of one atmosphere is represented by a column of water 32 feet high. In actual fact, the column of water would not be that high because here we're dealing with seawater, which has a greater density than fresh water. Well, now, Ned, when you dive down into the sea, for every 32 feet of water between you and the surface, your body is supporting an additional pressure of one atmosphere, or, in other words, 14.7 pounds per square inch of surface. It follows that at 320 feet, this pressure is equal to 10 kilometers, 100 atmospheres at 3,200 feet, and 1,000 atmospheres at 32,000 feet, or about 6 miles. This is the same as saying that if you could reach such a depth in the ocean, your body would undergo a pressure of 14,700 pounds per square inch. Now, Ned, do you know how many square inches there are in the surface of your body? I have no idea, Monsieur Aronnax. About 2,600. That many? And right now, those 2,600 square inches of yours are supporting a pressure of 38,220 pounds. Without my noticing it? Without your noticing it. And the reason you're not squashed by such pressure is that air at exactly the same pressure penetrates inside your body, and thus there's a perfect equilibrium between the inside and the outside pressure, which allows you to bear up bear up under it painlessly. But in the water, things are quite different. Yes, I see, answered Ned, who had become more attentive. Because the water surrounds you, but doesn't get inside. That's right, Ned. And this means that at 32 feet below the surface, you would be under an extra pressure of 38,220 pounds. At 320 feet, 10 times that pressure, or at 3,800 3,802 pounds, 382,000 pounds, and there we go. At 3,200 feet, 100 times that pressure, or 3,822,000 pounds at 32,000 feet, 1,000 times that pressure, or 38,220,000 pounds, or in other words, you'd be flattened out as if they had pulled you from between the plates of a hydraulic press. Good Lord, Ned exclaimed. Well then, if vertebrates several hundred yards long, with bodies built to scale, live at such depths, they must have a surface area equal to millions of square inches. Then the pressure they undergo must be measured in the hundreds of billions of pounds. So you can see how strong their bone structure and body would have to be in order to resist such pressure. But they must be built, answered Ned Land, with steel plates, 8 inches thick, like armored frigates. That's right, Ned. And then think of what damage could be produced by such an object traveling at high speed and striking the hull of a ship. Yes, you're right. Maybe, answered the Canadian, bowled over by these figures, but still unwilling to give in. Well, have I convinced you? You have convinced me of one thing, Professor, and that is that if such animals exist in the ocean depths, they would have to be as strong as you say. But if they don't exist, you stubborn harpooner, how do you explain what happened to the Scotia? Maybe it was, said Ned hesitantly. Come. Because, no, it couldn't be true, replied the Canadian. But this answer only proved how obstinate the harpooner was, nothing else. That day I pushed him no further. No one could deny what happened to the Scotia. The hole in its hull was so real that it had to be stopped up, and I don't think there could be any surer proof of a hole than this. But this hole hadn't just developed all by itself, and since it hadn't been produced by underwater rocks or machinery, it must necessarily be ascribed to the weapon of some animal. Moreover, to my way of thinking, for all the reasons stated above, this animal belonged to the subkingdom of the vertebrates, the class of mammals, the group of pisciforms, and finally the order of cetaceans. As to what family it belonged, whale, cachalot, or dolphin, as to its genus or species, that was a question to be cleared up later. But in order to solve this problem, one would have to dissect the unknown monster. In order to dissect it, one would have to capture it. In order to capture it, harpoon it, which was Ned Land's job. In order to harpoon it, see it, which was the crew's job, and in order to see it, meet up with it, which was a matter of chance. That is chapter 4. Just a moment here. Little Earl Grey tea. Chapter 5, A Random Search. For a while, little happened on board the Abraham Lincoln except for one event which displayed Ned Land's extraordinary skill and showed what confidence we could have in him. Off the Falkland Islands on June 30th, we communicated with some American whaling ships, and we learned that they had seen nothing of the narwhal. But one of them, the captain of the Monroe, knowing that Ned Land had shipped on board the Abraham Lincoln, asked for his help in hunting a whale they had sighted. Commander Farragut was eager to see Ned Land perform, and therefore authorized him to go aboard the Monroe. And our Canadian's luck was such that instead of one whale, he harpooned 2 in succession, striking one straight into the heart and capturing the other after a pursuit lasting only several minutes. There is no doubt about it, I thought. If the monster gets a taste of Ned Land's harpoon, I won't put money on the monster. The frigate skirted the southeast coast of South America at great speed. On the 3rd of July, we were at the mouth of the Straits of Magellan off the Cape of the Virgins. But Commander Farragut did not want to attempt this dangerous passage and set out a course around Cape Horn. The crew agreed with him to a man. And, in point of fact, was there any chance of meeting the narwhal in these narrow straits? Many of the sailors stated that this creature could not get through them, that it was too big. On July 6th, toward 3 in the afternoon and about 15 miles yet further south, the Abraham Lincoln went around that solitary island, that lost rock at the tip of South America to which Dutch sailors gave the name of their hometown, Cape Horn. The course was then changed towards the northwest, and on the next day the frigate's propeller was finally churning Pacific waters. "Keep your eyes open!" cried the sailors of the Abraham Lincoln. And they opened them wide. Their eyes and telescopes undoubtedly a bit dazzled by the prospect of $2,000, did not rest for a moment. Night and day people watched the surface of the ocean, and those who had special gifts for seeing in the dark had a 50% better chance of winning the prize money. As for me, even though I cared little about the money, I was no less watchful than the others, taking only several minutes for my meals and sleeping only several hours. Completely indifferent to sun or rain, I scarcely ever left the deck, whether leaning over the forecastle rails or holding on to the taffrail. My eyes eagerly devoured the cotton foam churning the sea white out to the horizon. And how often did I share the excitement of officers and crew when some capricious whale lifted its black back above the surface of the water. The frigate's deck would immediately fill with people. The hatches would vomit forth a torrent of sailors and officers, each one with his chest heaving and an anxious look in his eyes, would watch the whale's progress. I would stare till I was nearly blind, while Conseil, as impassive as ever, would say calmly, if Monsieur would be kind enough not to keep his eyes open, so wide open, Monsieur could see much better. But all the excitement would be for nothing. The Abraham Lincoln would alter its course and race toward the creature, nothing more than an ordinary whale or common sperm whale, which would soon disappear amid a storm of curses. Nevertheless, the weather held good. The voyage was progressing under the best of conditions. It was the bad season of the southern hemisphere for July. That region corresponds to our European January, but the sea remained calm and the air clear. Ned Land continued to show the greatest skepticism. He even refused to look at the ocean except during his turn on watch, or at least when no whale was in sight. This was a pity, for his extraordinary eyesight would have been very useful. But 8 hours out of 12, this stubborn Canadian stayed in his cabin, reading or sleeping. 100 times I reproached him for his indifference. Ah, he would answer. So nonsense, Monsieur Aronnax. And even if it was some animal, what chance would we have of seeing it? Why, we're just wandering around aimlessly. They say this creature nobody can find was last seen in mid-Pacific. All right, but that was 2 months ago. And according to what they say about your narwhal's character, it doesn't like to stay in one spot very long. He can move very fast. You know better than I, Professor, that nature doesn't do things without a reason. She wouldn't give a sluggish animal like that the ability to move fast if it didn't need to use this ability. So if this creature does exist, it's already far away. I had no answer for this. Obviously, we were wandering around blindly. What else could we do? Our chances were undoubtedly very limited. Nevertheless, as yet nobody had any doubts that we would succeed. And there was not a single sailor on board who would have bet against our sighting the narwhal soon. On July 20th, we crossed the Tropic of Capricorn at 105 degrees west longitude, and on the 27th of the same month, we crossed the equator at the 110th meridian. Once there, the frigate took a more definite westerly course and entered the waters of the mid-Pacific. Commander Farragut was right in thinking it was best to remain in deep water and stay away from land, which the creature always seemed to avoid. Probably because there isn't enough water for him, as the boatswain put it. The frigate, therefore, gave a wide berth to the Tuamotu Islands and the Marquesas and the Hawaiian Islands, crossed the Tropic of Cancer at 132 degrees west longitude, and headed for the China Seas. We were finally in the area of the monster's last little tricks, and, in a word, normal life on board came to an end. Hearts began beating madly, so much so that they would never be the same again. I cannot describe the nervous tension the crew was under. No one ate or slept any more. 20 times a day an error in judgment or a mirage seen by some sailor perched in the cross trees would cause intolerable feelings of anguish. And with these emotions, repeated 20 times a day, we all became so violently irritable that some reaction was bound to set in soon. And in fact, it wasn't long before it did set in. For 3 months, each day of which seemed like a century, the Abraham Lincoln cruised all over the North Pacific, chasing whales that had been sighted, making quick changes in course, veering suddenly from one tack to another, stopping abruptly, putting on steam or reversing its engines so quickly as to risk harming them, and leaving no corner unexplored between the coast of Japan and America. And it found nothing. Nothing but vast, deserted waters. Nothing even vaguely resembling a giant narwhal or an underwater island or the wreck of a sunken ship or a shifting reef or anything even slightly out of the ordinary. So a reaction finally set in. Everybody became discouraged, and this led to skepticism. The men on board were gripped by a new feeling, composed of 3/10 shame and 7/10 anger. They felt that they had been a bunch of fools to let themselves get involved in such a pipe dream, and this feeling made them furious. All the emotions stored up for a year poured forth at once, and everyone thought only of catching up on the hours of eating and sleeping they had missed. The human mind being as changeable as it is, people went from one excess to another. The warmest partisans of the enterprise or destined to become its most ardent critics. Excuse me. The reaction rose from the bowels of the ship, from the coal trimmer's quarters to the officers' mess. And surely, without Commander Farragut's special stubbornness, the frigate would have turned south once and for all. In any case, this useless search could not go on much longer, and the Abraham Lincoln had no reason to feel ashamed, for it had made every possible effort to succeed. No crew in the American Navy has ever shown greater patience or willingness. They could not be blamed for their failure. There was nothing else to do but return. A petition to this effect was made to the commander, but he refused to change his plans. The sailors no longer hid their discontent, and the work on board suffered as a result. I don't mean to say there was a mutiny, but after a reasonable period of refusing to consider their wishes, Commander Farragut, as Columbus had once done, asked for 3 more days. If during this time the monster put in no appearance, the men at the helm could give it 3 turns, and the Abraham Lincoln would head for European waters. This promise was made on November 2nd. Its first effect was to rally the ship's crew. Once again, the ocean was carefully scanned. Each man wanted to give it one last look in which he could sum up his memory of the trip. Telescopes were put to use feverishly. It was the last challenge thrown to the giant narwhal, and he could scarcely fail to answer this summons to appear. 2 days passed by. The Abraham Lincoln was cruising under low boiler pressure. 1,000 methods were tried for attracting the animal's attention or arousing him from his apathy, should he be in these waters. Huge chunks of lard were dragged behind the ship, to the great satisfaction of the sharks, I must admit. The ship's boats spread out in all directions around the Abraham Lincoln while it hove to, and they left no corner of the sea unexplored. But the evening of November 4th arrived without this underwater mystery having been unveiled. On the next day, November 5th, at noon, the allotted 3-day period expired. After that, Commander Farragut, faithful to his promise, was to steer a course to the southeast and definitely abandon northern Pacific waters. The frigate was then at 31 degrees 15 minutes north latitude and 136 degrees 42 minutes east longitude. Japan lay less than 200 miles to leeward. Night was coming on. 8 o'clock had just struck. Thick clouds hid the new moon, and the sea was rolling gently under the bow of the ship. At this moment, I was leaning on the forward starboard railing. Conseil was stationed next to me and looking at the sea off the bow. The crew, perched in the rigging, was examining the horizon as it slowly grew narrower and darker. The officers, equipped with their night binoculars, scouring the increasing gloom. Occasionally the ocean would sparkle with light from the moon as it peeped out from between 2 clouds. Then all trace of light would disappear into darkness. I looked at Conseil, and could see he was feeling little of the emotion gripping everyone else. Or, at least, so I thought. But perhaps for the first time, his nerves were a tingle with a feeling of curiosity. "All right now, Conseil," I said. "This is your last chance to pocket $2,000. "If monsieur will permit me saying so," Conseil answered. "I have never given a thought to the prize money. I think that even if the government of the Union had promised $100,000, it would be none the poorer." "You're right, Conseil. This was a foolish venture after all, and we jumped at it too quickly. Think how much time we've lost and how much useless excitement we've undergone. We could have been back in France 6 months ago." In Monsieur's little apartment, continued Conseil, in Monsieur's museum. And I could already have classified Monsieur's fossils. I'm sorry. And Monsieur's uh, Barbaroussa would already be installed in his cage at the Botanical Gardens, attracting all the city's curiosity seekers. Right, Conseil. But even that doesn't take into account that people will laugh at us when we get back. Yes, Conseil answered calmly, people will laugh at Monsieur. But I must say, go ahead, yes, go ahead, Conseil, that the Monsieur will be getting what he deserves. Really? When one has the honor to be a scientist like Monsieur, one doesn't get mixed up in... But Conseil was unable to finish his compliment, for in the midst of a general silence, a voice was suddenly heard. It was Ned Land's voice, and he was shouting, "Ahoy! There it is! A beam to leeward!" And on that little bit of a cliffhanger, we will leave it there because that is the end of Chapter 5. And when we are back, and my intent is to be back on Friday at 4, it is actually a day that the library will be closed. They're taking July 3rd off in response to July 4th being on a Saturday. So the libraries will actually be closed on Friday, July 3rd. But as I always say, adventure and mystery stops for no one. So we're going to try and do the chapters 6 and 7 on Friday at 4 p.m. And we'll be doing it from a different location instead. But I hope you can join me for that. I can see our adventures getting going here, and we're starting to see what's going on. We'll have to find out what Ned Land saw in our next meeting, and I hope you can join me for it Friday at 4. Thank you very much. We'll see you again.